G7 leaders and heads of state from some of the world's richest nations sat down for a plenary session on the second day of the summit. President Cyril Ramaphosa and Moon Jae-in from South Korea, together with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, are also part of the meeting. India's President Narendra Modi, also an invited guest, joined the session remotely. Leaders from the United States, Japan, Germany, Britain, France, Italy and Canada are expected to discuss a plan to rebuild the world economy and adopt a health declaration aimed at planning a better future for future pandemics. EU leaders attending the G7 summit in Britain have warned their host Boris Johnson to keep his word on the Brexit deal with the bloc amid tensions in the Northern Ireland. They say the EU was united in demanding that Britain should implement the entire agreement. Johnson has called for understanding and compromise. The G7 summit appears to be only heightening tensions between EU and Britain over post-Brexit arrangements in Northern Ireland. Now, it's reported President Macron told Boris Johnson that he had to stick by agreements reached with Brussels if he wants to resettle Anglo-French relations. But earlier, Britain's Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab blames the EU for post-Brexit problems in Northern Ireland, accusing Brussels of being bloody-minded and purist of over-implementing post-Brexit arrangements.
I think, to be fair, there's quite a lot of misunderstanding around the EU about the situation in Northern Ireland, the balance of the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, and I was just in a gentle way getting across what that means in and I think that we'll have some pragmatic solutions. And if we don't, then I think that what our friends have also understood is that it's the prime duty of the UK government to uphold the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom. And that's what we're going to do, and we'll do whatever it takes to ensure that.
The SABC's Laura Makin-Isherwood joins us now from Cornwall, where the summit is taking place. Laura, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe. Now, the world's richest and most powerful democratic nations face a myriad of challenges, from fending off autocratic governments and global warming to the lingering COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these are some of the priorities on the agenda at the G7 summit. So what's your understanding of the progress made in addressing these?
Well, there's been multiple sessions that have taken place already over the last 2 days. A lot of them have been focusing on the pandemic, as you've already said. That could be to do with building back better, as the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says, encouraging trade, encouraging the growth of new jobs and investment in the different G7 nations, and of course bringing in those guest nations too to the fold, so South Africa, Australia, South Korea and India. We've already had announcements from the US President Joe Biden that he's set to donate 500 million doses of vaccine to countries that currently have little access to them. The UK has jumped on board with that as well, saying that it will share 100 million doses. And there are expectations, but that by the end of this weekend, we could hit a figure of around 1 billion doses between the G7 nations. Now, of course, there were more sessions this afternoon about the pandemic. Melinda French Gates and also Patrick Vallance, who has been a fundamental figure within the government here in our pandemic response in the UK, have delivered a presentation to the G7 and those guest nations, trying to encourage a Carbis Bay agreement whereby all G7 leaders throw as much cash and resources into their responses to a potential future pandemic as possible. They also want to push this idea of being able to respond within 100 days, potentially responding to a future virus with the likes of a vaccine by harnessing enough or as much technology and data and resources as they possibly can. So there's a lot of talk, a lot of a coming together of ideas in order to come up with a future plan and prevent the current situation that we've faced over the last year or so.
And having said that, can we expect solutions that will assist the poorer nations with post-COVID-19 economic recovery?
Well, South Africa and India have really been pushing for a waiver of intellectual property rights on vaccines to allow nations that currently don't have a lot of them within their stock, if you like, to be able to manufacture them more cheaply within their home nations more quickly and get their populations vaccinated at speed. We understand that President Ramaphosa has spoken to US President Joe Biden. He's tweeted recently that Joe Biden has actually supported his calls for that TRIPS waiver. So, I mean, anything is possible here. This is all about conversation. It's about bringing these leaders together and trying to push essentially for the things that each individual nation wants. The UK government is really welcoming that idea of hearing what other countries really want here. But whether or not President Ramaphosa is going to garner support from all G7 nations for that, I'm not sure, because this lifting of intellectual property rights has been a little controversial elsewhere.
Well, we've seen G7 finance ministers already agreeing on a global unified minimum tax rate for all multinational corporations, and this will certainly affect the tech giants such as Google, such as Amazon. So in hindsight, Laura, will this translate to some form of aid for those developing and poorer nations?
Well, again, these are about conversations that are starting here and planning for the future. Maybe we will see more aid developments and more pledges for that. We know that the United Kingdom here has come under significant fire for its decision to roll back on the amount of money it pledges to developing nations in terms of aid from 0.7% of GDP to 0.5%, which when you're looking at in percentage points, it doesn't sound a lot, does it? But actually, in real money terms, it's billions of pounds. So there will be a lot of pressure here, not just in terms of cash offerings to developing nations and areas that need more investment, but also in terms of those vaccines, as we said so many times before.
Do you get a sense then that the COVID-19 pandemic will sort of divert attention from, big issues such as climate change and clean energy?
Well, not really, because this summit has been all about climate change as well as the pandemic, of course. Tomorrow we've got a big session planned. We've got David Attenborough, who is a world-renowned documentary maker and someone who's really been pushing for climate change to be taken seriously over the last couple of years. He's going to be giving a video message to leaders tomorrow. We've had multiple protests as well around St Ives and Falmouth and Carbis Bay. People really want climate change to be taken seriously, and the G7 leaders will also be trying to come together to speak about what they can do within their nations to try to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And also we hear from lobbyists as well that they're expecting some kind of financial commitment, maybe to the tune of around £100 billion. They hope in trying to make sure that these zero emission targets are really met. They've had the Paris Accord that's been signed a few years ago, but there's concern and also criticism that hasn't been taken seriously enough. So perhaps now, with Boris Johnson as the chair of the G7 summit this year and someone who's really pushing for climate and conservation projects, that's the whole reason really why it was brought down to Cornwall here, because of the biodiversity that this county really holds and possesses. So perhaps we might get more confirmation, more commitment from these leaders here again by the end of this weekend.
And more so because the G7 leaders still need to sort out, whether substantial new funding will be allocated to the Clean Green Initiative, or whether they will settle with just establishing a loose framework for rivaling China's $1 trillion BRI.
Yeah, exactly. That green sort of network, if I understand what you're asking me correctly, is about that sort of Belt and Road initiative that China has really been pushing. The G7 leaders here have been trying to come up with some sort of green initiative that's been pushed by Joe Biden, the US president, again, who seems to be quite influential here and is really trying to draw a sense of unity between G7 leaders, something that hasn't been experienced over the last couple of years, of course, with Donald Trump, president of the United States. He was quite quite unpredictable, I suppose, keeping everybody on their toes. But now this sense of a green Belt and Road alternative is really coming to fruition. We're not quite sure exactly what that's going to mean. In the past, green initiatives have been suggested, but a lot of investment from Western nations particularly often come with strings attached, I suppose, whereas China will plug money into countries and ask for nothing in response. So could this be finally a time when the West can come together and the sort of economic forefront sort of nations, can they come together now and come up with an alternative that will really work?
And this G7 summit appears to be heightening tensions between EU and Britain over the agreements that have been reached in Brussels, and to a point where French President Emmanuel Macron told Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, in no uncertain terms that he need to stick by those agreements made in Brussels. So what's your understanding of whether Boris Johnson did indeed have concrete responses to those concerns?
Well, those bilateral meetings, of course, take place in private. Any word that comes out from them is obviously at the discretion of the individual governments. Boris Johnson has been giving interviews to UK media here, and he's kind of saying that there are laws that are in place they must be abided by. In the case of Northern Ireland, which is obviously coming up quite often here when it comes to trade, and of course the Northern Ireland Protocol, there's been a lot of questions over that. Boris Johnson said there need to be compromises made on both sides, but that's a very tricky, a very sensitive area of the United Kingdom, and you don't want that to mess up, really.
All right, Laura, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for the update. That was SABC's reporter Laura Makin-Isherwood speaking to us live from Cornwall in Britain.